Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. Mindfulness. As a concept and as a practice, mindfulness has been embraced by celebrities like Oprah Winfrey, best-selling authors like Jon Kabat-Zinn, and even CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who hire private meditation coaches to help them deal with their stress. And now it seems that mindfulness is marketed to the masses as a kind of panacea for all that ails us. Mindfulness. What is it? Where did it come from? And does it work? My guest today, my colleague and good friend, Dr. Chong Mai, has joined us to talk about mindfulness and to help us better understand this concept and practice. Welcome, Chong. How are you?
It's nice to see you, Ozzie.
Yeah, you're joining us from New York, I understand, even though you're on the faculty here at Appalachian State University. We've all had to learn how to work remotely during this pandemic. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Why don't we start by letting you introduce yourself? Tell us what your academic specialty is, what you study and teach at our university.
Sure. My specialty is Chinese and Vietnamese Buddhism, and I consider myself a historian. I teach classes on confronting death, classes on other types of Asian religions as well, including Buddhism. And my interests are in a wide variety of historical issues, one of which is the transmission, the movement of Buddhism across different cultures and societies and languages.
So I guess that last comment, if you're interested in the transmission or translation of Buddhism across cultures, that kind of brings us to our topic today, because it seems to me that in many ways, people in America at least equate the practice of mindfulness with Buddhism or with its Buddhist roots. So maybe you could just tell us what mindfulness is and kind of how it got to be so popularized in American culture.
Right. So mindfulness, as it's understood now in contemporary terms, is depicted as a kind of self-therapy in which you can cultivate a type of awareness or consciousness by yourself in quiet sitting, and other types of practices that's considered to have a positive psychological effects, including the reduction of stress and also increase of happy states of mind.
So is it meditation, or is it different from meditation, or related to meditation? How do those concepts work together?
Right, that's a good question. When we look at mindfulness, one of the things that we see as a historian, one of the things that we see is that mindfulness is just one type of mental training, one of many within Buddhist traditions. So one thing, if I'm interested in the transition of Buddhism, for example, what I note right away is that mindfulness, as it is described, has been extracted out of a very complex native tradition and context that looks at a whole variety of, let's call it, spiritual practices or mental training. So it's actually one out of many types of a broader term that you can call meditation.
So I've heard mindfulness described as a kind of non-judgmental focus on the present moment, as a way of disrupting a kind of cycle of thinking where you either get trapped with sort of past regret or future anxiety, and that you can, by focusing on the present in a non-judgmental way, you can break these kind of destructive cycles of thinking. Is that a fair description?
I think that is indeed a fair description, and that's how most people do see it. And in that context also, one of the interesting things is, the question you can raise is, in what sense is that even Buddhist? We can say it's Buddhist inspired because the teachers who teach these techniques have a history of studying with Buddhist masters, but as it's practiced now in its, let's say, clinical setting, it's fair to ask, in what sense is it Buddhist?
Right, and that kind of anticipates my next question, that it seems like mindfulness, particularly as it's practiced in a clinical setting, is very practical, very practically oriented. And in most cases, it seems to me it's practiced without any reference to ethical standards of Buddhism. And in that sense, I mean, is it Buddhism light, or is it a practice that's extracted and stripped of the underlying principles and theories in Buddhism? Or maybe it's just a westernized or secularized form of Buddhism. I don't know, or all of the above. Maybe you can help me with that a little bit.
I think it's all of the above, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's interesting, because it's complex in that way. It can exist within different contexts of interpretation, in which the answer to that question can align on a whole spectrum of responses. For example, some people will say, no, it's not Buddhism at all, and I'm not Buddhist, I'm not religious, and this is merely a form of, let's say, self-help therapy, right, on one end. And on the other end, it could be an important part of someone's Buddhist practice who see themselves self-identify as Buddhist. So if we look at that spectrum, I think one of the interesting things we can see is how I think the context becomes more complicated the closer we get to the spectrum where it becomes a self-avowed Buddhist practice.
Do you think it's curious, maybe it's just the way my mind works. I work with evangelical religions, and part of evangelical religion is to attract people into the practice. Is there a sense in which mindfulness is an entry, a gateway into Buddhism, do you think? Does it attract people to the religion, or does it just stay kind of isolated from the rest of the Buddhist practice?
That is a really interesting comparison. My gut response now is that among people who talk about it as a secular form of psychotherapy, self-help, they would shy away from calling it a form of gateway practice to Buddhism. Because people who tend to do that by self-selection are not comfortable with religious identities.
Right.
So there are critics from outside who do say, though, well, you can present it any way you want, but clearly it has Buddhist associations. And that's one way to draw people into the practice of Buddhism. We see that more commonplace among critics who are suspicious of the use of mindfulness in school settings, in public school settings, for example. Then the arguments really become salient.
Yeah, I remember when transcendental meditation was popular in the U.S., and there was a movement to try to get transcendental meditation taught. Same sort of controversy arose. Is it a religion, or is it a practice that leads to calmer children? Right, and it's difficult to dissociate the practice, I think, from its foundation. But you raise another question for me here as we talk about this kind of secularized form of mindfulness, or dissociated form of mindfulness, at least from its Buddhist roots. Some of the things that I have read, and you were gracious to send me material, is critical of mindfulness in that there's a concern that it promotes the idea that all the problems that we have in our society are internal and can be dealt with individually, and it obscures the kind of larger social ills that are systemic, and perhaps discourages us from seeking change outside of our own selves. Is that a valid critique, do you think? Is mindfulness too inwardly directed and obscures kind of political and social activism beyond the self?
My personal take is that type of critique definitely is fair. and has certain strengths and illuminates some complexities we've been talking about. On the other hand, such critiques also are a slightly heavy-handed. So let me first explain the first part. Critiques that say that mindfulness in our contemporary setting is overly commodified, for example, and participates too much in the market economy and merely makes people more docile consumers or docile workers, kind of like in the shape of someone ready to exploit themselves in the capitalist system. That clearly is true because mindfulness can be used in order to make more docile workers who are less interested in systemic problems that gives rise to the stress. I think that's a very illuminating critique of mindfulness.
Right.
One weakness of it is you can actually use that critique on anything in our society that provides comfort.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting critique as well, and I think it's probably more prominent. It seems like that has been something that has come up in the literature recently, at least from my reading of it. And one commentator so far as to call mindfulness a social anesthesia,
Yes.
which I thought was an interesting comment.
Well, it's the old line of religion as the opiate of the masses.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mindfulness is the opiate of the masses.
Yeah. Religion keeps us. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think to a certain extent that's true, but like I said, the weakness of that critique is there are lots of things that are the opiate of the masses in our current economic and political situation, not just mindfulness.
Yeah. All right. So let me comment on some things that that proponents of mindfulness say that this practice can do for the practitioner. Okay, and I'd just like to get your take. Does it work in these cases? Okay, so some at a kind of very basic level, mindfulness is supposed to relieve stress. Okay, so it has applications, say, in the workplace. What do you think? Is mindfulness effective in relieving sort of the everyday stressors in our life?
From the literature that I've read, I think there is solid scientific data to strongly suggest that indeed it does have positive effects on reducing stress.
Yeah.
That alone, though, is not enough because we should ask more questions such as, well, what other practices reduces stress? Running, exercise, playing a musical instrument as well. Running a charity, helping out those who are less fortunate than you are, also reduces stress. So it's interesting to me that people just point out that it reduces stress, but neglect to point out the other critiques, which is it's a form of practice you can do by yourself.
Right.
You don't have to join a community or be close to anyone or be committed to any values, any strong values that change your community.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned the science. Is there actually science, say, that would indicate that someone practicing mindfulness or any of these other activities reduce cortisol levels in their blood, for example, the stress? Is there scientific evidence that actually occurs during mindfulness training?
The literature that I've read actually does suggest that to be the case, and it has long-term effects as well. So I think there is some type of scientific evidence for that. But again, the question is to what extent and how reliable is it? And who does it not work for? What cases will it not work? Like deep, like clinical depression, it probably mindfulness training probably is not as effective. So following the critique of overselling mindfulness, on the other hand, I think it's a valid.
You sound like that you are of the mind, no pun intended, that mindfulness has been oversold to address all problems, and it's maybe one of many things that can help us reduce stress, but it's also not an answer to all. Be considered, say, in a more holistic approach or a holistic way of seeing things.
I think that's right. And holistic is a good word, because when we talk about the movement, transmission of Buddhism broadly within the scope of history, we see that Buddhism is transmitted generally holistically as a very complex tradition that has many facets, such as ethical values, sacred authority, community, rituals, material culture, stories, myth. And once we remove just one small practice out of it, then it really changes the holistic pattern. And other types
Right.
of authority will replace Buddhist authority.
Yeah, so let me ask you this question. You mentioned that mindfulness, it is effective in relieving stress with some people. It probably is not effective with more serious conditions like clinical depression. Is there the potential for this overselling of mindfulness to have adverse effects? For example, if someone is clinically depressed, do you think that they may be hurt by thinking mindfulness training would help them when in fact they should be seeking other forms of professional help?
I am speaking as a scholar of Buddhism. I haven't seen specific data on that, but I think there are some current studies on it specifically, arising specifically because of this overselling of mindfulness. There's a pushback by scholars in psychology, in Buddhist studies as well, who are trying to push back and say, what are the negative effects? In fact, the Buddhist tradition itself does not oversell meditation or mindfulness, and says there are serious negative consequences that can arise if you perform meditation by yourself without an expert guide.
Yeah, I know from my own personal experience, when I have tried to practice meditation to relieve anxiety or stress, that I sometimes feel greater success. So it has a kind of opposite effect on my own practice. Sometimes I get stressed out because I'm not good at it. And it seems like that unguided meditation could have the potential for that sort of adverse effect.
Right. There are some studies going on now about negative side effects of meditation for people who probably shouldn't be doing it, maybe triggering other psychoses, for example. Depending on the type of meditation too. I mean, if you think about it as sustained introspection in the state of one's own mind, that can be dangerous for certain people, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Are there
not a professional guide? Maybe there are things we shouldn't see in our own mind without expert help.
Yeah, I think a thing I read was talking about the experience of a person who was, as you said, in prolonged kind of introspection, and suddenly some repressed memories came into consciousness, and they weren't prepared by themselves to deal with that kind of experience. So I could see why, I could see how this type of practice would be. So another kind of potential claim for mindfulness is that it helps one to sharpen and focus their attention. So I think oftentimes people have suggested that perhaps mindfulness could be helpful in cases where someone has attention deficit disorder, for example. Do you see any kind of positive outcomes with mindfulness practice in the case of someone wanting to use it to sharpen their focus and sharpen their attention to detail, and to be able to be more attentive to the task at hand?
again, from the literature, I think that there is evidence to suggest that practicing mindfulness certainly enhances the ability to sustain concentration. But again, I like to ask questions, and some of the questions I like to ask is, what is the Buddhist view of that? The Buddhist view of that is sustained attention in and of itself is completely useless outside of some religious context, some religious value or goal or purpose. In fact, a sustained, powerful consciousness can be directed at malice as well. So the Buddhist tradition does talk about that, the dangers of that. And so from the Buddhist point of view, we should ask those questions. And from a non-Buddhist secular point of view, we can ask questions such as, what other practices also enhances concentration and may improve concentration? It could be a whole variety of other practices too, like playing an instrument, playing a sport, practicing puzzles every day. I think that could have the same type of positive effect. What makes mindfulness special?
Yeah, so I think that's the question, right? That it is being marketed as something that is new and special and innovative. In fact, the criticisms now are suggesting that it's obviously not new and perhaps not even special. And a couple of times you've mentioned that extracting one single practice like mindfulness from the overall tradition this doesn't give you a good kind of exposure to the tradition itself. So if you could, how would you put the genie back in the bottle? How would you put mindfulness back into the context of Buddhism that would give us a more holistic understanding of how this thing works within the context of its tradition?
Right. So within the context of its tradition, we can see examples of that throughout Buddhist communities in Asia, but also increasingly in the West as well. So this secular mindfulness trend of movement is a reflection of only one part of Buddhism outside of the West and also in the West, which is to say, to put it more concretely, maybe, there are plenty of Western Buddhists in the West who situate mindfulness within the broader practice of Buddhism that involves rituals, festivals, communities, commitment to a community, commitment to values, raising a family as well. So it's tied in with broader values and what we can call maybe a worldview, a Buddhist inflected worldview.
Yeah. So it seems to me that kind of appropriating this one practice might even be something akin to what we would call cultural appropriation today. From an outsider's perspective, pulling what you like from a culture and then making it into something you want it to be, not something that was meant to be. Is that a fair kind of statement? Do you see Western practice of mindfulness as a kind of cultural appropriation?
I honestly don't know, because I see that as a very loaded term of analysis.
Yeah.
On one hand, I definitely do see that. There are obvious cases of it, but also there are some cases where it's not so clear because it's Asian Buddhist communities who are actually doing this. So are they appropriating Buddhism? Well, they are Asian Buddhists. Right. But they're following because this is basically because of the globalization of our media, of our books, of YouTube, for example. Basic access to different representations of Buddhism now floating across language, culture, society, countries, nations. So if that's happening, say, in some rural community in Cambodia, it is still appropriation. I don't know.
Yeah. So just as a kind of wrap-up question here, if if you were to try to lead someone toward a better understanding of Buddhism from a holistic perspective, gathering that just the simple practice of mindfulness might not be the best place to start. Where would one start? Would it be with the so-called Four Noble Truths that we always read about in introductory chapters to Buddhism, or how would one kind of go about better understanding Buddhism in its context from a more holistic perspective? I know taking your course would be a great step, right?
Yeah. So to answer that would take a whole semester.
Right. Yeah.
But seriously, one approach would be to go to different communities and see what Buddhist practice is within a lived context of people who go to a certain place and who interact with material objects and incorporate this very, let's say, complex worldview within every aspect of their lived experience. And then seeing that it has so many dimensions, and see how all the different dimensions of Buddhist life, like other religious lives, are very complex, just as Muslim life, or Jewish life, or Catholic life is complex. So if people start from where they are, then they can reflect on how complex their own religious tradition is, or the tradition where they grew up, and try to imagine how other religious traditions are just as complex, and how maybe it's absurd to take one practice out of Catholicism and say that's Catholicism, like the Mass, that's Catholicism.
Yeah, I like that. Right. Yeah, I like that phrase, lived experience, and I think that's really crucial here. Well, Gong, this has been fascinating. I've learned today that mindfulness by itself may be a helpful practice, but probably there are other things that in our lives that can produce the same kind of results. So it shouldn't be thought of as a kind of overall panel, all the things that trouble us. And I appreciate you bringing your expertise to this topic. Thank you so much.
I had a great conversation. Thank you, Ozzie.
Yeah, and I hope you stay safe in New York. So we'll maybe be back together in the office soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for everyone who's joined us today. That's it for our program this week. I hope you will join us next week on AppTV as we continue to explore the relationship between religion, culture, society. Until then, it's Ozzie Ostwald.